Let's talk the Latino vote. And that's been a topic of discussion politically in this country, especially after the 2024 election when Latinos shifted towards Trump. Now, Latinos have been getting a lot of attention for shifting towards Trump in 2024. But the fact is that the entire community, the entire nation shifted towards the right. We even saw New York City, New York State shift 10, 12 points towards Trump. So, yes, the whole country shifted to the right. But for the sake of this conversation, let's talk about the Latino vote, the trends that we're seeing, some of the polling, some of the numbers that we've been seeing since the end of last year in 2025. We have a lot of numbers, we have a lot of data, we have a lot of elections to go off of to give us an indication that Latinos are turning on Trump. Even some Latinos that voted for Trump that are turning on Trump, people that regret their vote. Reasons why? Because of the economy isn't at the place where Latinos were expecting it to be by this point, with these tariffs that have been impacting consumers and even small businesses. Having to tag higher prices on goods for people has not been good. I've had conversations with family members of mine that are small business owners and their friends that are also small business owners, admitting to me how the ways that they add these fees on these products that they're selling to customers because of these tariffs. So it's a very real thing. It's impacting people on the ground every single day. Those are the conversations and the topics of discussions of economic stressors that people are worried about right now on the ground. Things are not more affordable. Things are pretty hard. These ICE raids are making it really hard for immigrant workers to go to work. One clear example is in my hometown in the Rio Grande Valley, where the Builders Association and the realtors right now are extremely concerned about their industry down in South Texas. I imagine it's similar in other parts where it's Latino heavy populations where workers aren't showing up to work because ICE raids were happening at these worksite locations. So people aren't going to work no more. So there's been this shift towards Democrats. And I'll argue that it's not because Democrats are popular. The Democratic brand is still very unpopular, but it's just that people just want to run away from Trump. And when you run away from Trump, what is it to go to? Is Democrats, because there's only two major parties in this country. So it's not because Democrats are completely persuading Latinos to come back to them. It's just that the current conditions and the current administration with these really massive ICE raids and the brutality that we're seeing from the Trump administration and how it's hurting the economy, it's convincing people enough to shift back towards center-left candidates. Now, the Pew Research Center, which is a gold standard of a lot of research with Hispanic trends in this country, asked people about their opinion of Donald Trump. They polled 5,000 Latinos across the country, right? It's a very good number, a very good sample size of Latinos across the country. 70% of the respondents in that poll disapprove of Donald Trump. Only 27 approve, and 55% disapprove strongly. So it's not only disapproving lightly, it's disapprove strongly. They have a very strong opinion against Donald Trump. And this wasn't the case in 2024. I don't have those numbers with me. But Trump, for example, won 55% of the Latino vote in Texas, which is the highest number that a Republican had ever gained statewide here in Texas, surpassing, I think, George Bush in the early 2000s, when George Bush was also doing famously really well with Latinos here in Texas. So we have after poll that is showing that Latinos are shifting away from the Republicans and Donald Trump as a response and as a consequence to the issue on immigration and the issue on the economy. Now, Donald Trump, in many ways, had persuaded America that immigrants were the problem and that Democrats were destroying this economy and that immigrants were destroying this economy. He had the narrative won. He had convinced Americans that his vision was the right vision and the right approach to fixing the economy. It's by getting rid of these immigrants that were taking everybody's jobs, and that Democrats were these Marxist socialists that were just going to destroy and make everything worse. That's sort of the framework that he was working in, if he even had a framework or a thought process like that. But at least that's the way it came off to me. But now, after a year or more than a year since he took office in 2025, people have clearly seen that this is not that they voted for one thing and they're getting something else. So immediately in 2025, we got this big, beautiful bill, what we call the big ugly bill, that slashed funding in Medicaid for millions of hardworking Americans from now until the next 5 years. There's going to be cuts to healthcare access and services in rural America. And a lot of Latinos live in rural America and small towns as well across the country. A lot of folks that prefer to live out in the rural parts of Texas and small towns, like Latinos, form a big part of that. In Texas, for example, 42% of small towns are Latinos, about 40%. So it's a sizable amount. So rural Texas very much also has a big Latino population. So, and then of course, we're not just seeing it in polling. We're not just seeing this response to Donald Trump, against Donald Trump and against MAGA in the polling and people being asked. We actually have real electoral results in opposition to MAGA from Latinos. The most recent election that we saw here in Texas was that Senate District 9 election, where Taylor Remitt, a Democrat, a union guy that got outspent by the Republican 20-1, may I add, and how difficult that is to pull off. Definitely didn't have the money to compete with the Republicans. And then he ran in a district that was a plus 17 Trump district, where Trump won by 17 points. The results came in that special election earlier this year in January 2026, and he won by 14 points. It wasn't even close. I think some pundits thought it could be an interesting race, maybe a close race, but he ended up blowing out the Republican opponent, although being outspent 20-1. And what we saw there is that one of the big reasons that was able to happen was that Latinos voted for Taylor Remitt. Nearly 80% of Latinos voted for Taylor Remitt, 79% to be exact. When you look at the very specific Latino precincts in that Senate district, you see that there's huge numbers in support for the Democrat, for Taylor Remitt in that race. The very same precincts where when Trump was running in 2024, it was a 50-50 split. So we're looking at 25 to 30 point swings towards Democrats just a little bit over a year after the Trump election in 2024. That's a huge turnaround. And it goes to say that Latinos truly are the battleground in this country. I've said for a couple of years now that Latinos are not married to the Republican or the Democratic Party. I think the generation of my parents that were farm workers in the 60s, during the Kennedy era, maybe even into the Clinton era, they were very much attached to the Democratic Party. Older folks like that generation of Mexican Americans were more attached to the Democratic Party. As the 2000s came on and the millennials came of age, it just didn't seem, I've never felt that my generation was married. My generation of people that grew up millennial, and even more so Gen Z, and Gen Z is a lot more distant from political parties, even than millennials. It just wasn't a thing to attach yourself to a political party. And I think we're starting to see that bear out in the numbers, is that in one election, you could see people vote for Republicans and somebody even as harmful as Donald Trump, and then turn around 2 years later and vote for progressives. That is very possible in the Latino electorate right now. And through 2025, before this Taylor Remitt race in North Texas, we also saw special elections or other 2025 statewide or state House of Delegate elections, for example, in Virginia. And even though Latinos make a small percentage of the population in the state of Virginia, we saw that there was a huge increase in support for the Democratic candidate there, Spanberger, who's now the governor of Virginia. We started seeing those numbers there in Virginia, started seeing those numbers in that governor's race as well in New Jersey. We started seeing trends, but we weren't sure if those trends were going to happen in Texas. Because everybody always says, well, the Latinos in Texas are more conservative. You can't compare them. Well, now we have actual data and some points here. And of course, there's a flurry of races that have been happening at local school board races and local county races and municipal races where we've seen people that are outspokenly progressive or Democrat have been winning in areas that have been won by Republicans in the past. And then we fast forward to right now. So we just ended early vote here in Texas for this Texas primary. It's an open primary. People could choose if they want to vote in the Democratic or the Republican primary at the voting location. And for the first time since 2002, I was talking about this yesterday, for the first time since 2002, Democrats, at least during the early vote section of this voting period, we still have to get through election day on March 3rd for election day voters, but at least through the first 2 weeks of early vote, we've had the highest number of people voting in a Democratic primary since 2002. More people choosing to vote in the Democratic primary at the polling location than Republican. Over 100,000 more people voting Democratic primary in the Republican primary in the state that is thought to be a Republican powerhouse, which has been, to be fair, for over 30 years. Republicans have been winning every single statewide election ever since the Ann Richards era. So that's another indicator that where we're seeing we haven't looked at the specific Latino numbers and Latino voters in these primaries. But if you look at Latino areas in the Rio Grande Valley, let's look at Stark County, for example. Stark County is seeing nearly a double amount of people showing up for the Democratic primary in 2026 compared to 2022. I was looking at the numbers and I was struck that over 8,000 people in Stark County, Texas. This is Rio Grande City, Roma, for whoever's familiar with South Texas, some small cities there in the western portion of the Rio Grande Valley. In that specific county, over 8,000 people voted in the Democratic primary, and only 147 people voted in the Republican primary. Now, what makes this extraordinary is that Donald Trump won this county. And this was a county that was Hillary Clinton 75%, Beto O'Rourke 75%, Barack Obama 75%. It was consistently one of the most Democratic county nationally. And then there was this massive turnaround in 2024, and we started seeing it around 2020, started shifting, and then we saw Trump finally get 60% of the vote in 2024. And now we're seeing this just 2 years later, we see this. And now when you think about a county like Stark County, it's heavily militarized by the Department of Homeland Security. A lot of Border Patrol agents live out there, a lot of folks that are involved in that industry. But of course, there's also a lot of folks out there that are bothered by it. Recently, there was news that the Border Patrol, Department of Homeland Security, wanted to add 3 Border Patrol checkpoints in this small populated community that is 95% Latino or Mexican American. And the county judge there came out very upset, saying that it was very unfair. We already have the border wall. We already have razor wire. We have buoys in the river. We already have massive technology here. We have blimps. We have helicopters. We have a ton of state police here that is facilitating the process for Border Patrol. What more do you want? Now they're adding 3 checkpoints, which is completely going to destroy the economy in Stark County. So this is a direct response to that, I think, that a vast majority of the voters are showing up for the Democratic primary. They're not showing up for Cornyn. And Cruz, think about this. This is a county that Trump won with about 60% of the vote. But right now, there is a very contested Republican primary between Paxton and Cornyn, and people there don't care. They don't care to vote for that race. They're showing up for the Democratic primary. And I get it. There's a local Democratic establishment there. There's still a lot of Democrats elected at a local level for county commissioner, for county judge, for constable, just as the piece. I get it. That could be driving some of these numbers more for Democrats because usually it's the Democrats that win for these local county seats. But this is still a very glaring number. The gap shouldn't be this big. So if this is an indication, so now I've talked about Senate District 9 with the Latinos there in urban areas, there in Fort Worth. Now I'm talking about really rural areas in South Texas, like in Stark County. Across the Rio Grande Valley, we've also seen an increase, not as glaring as Stark County, but we are seeing an increase, and these are heavily Latino populated areas. I haven't looked at Vote Hub's numbers statewide, but I'm willing to bet that Latinos are helping drive some of these primary numbers up. I had a conversation with Etienne Rosas a couple of days ago, who's a Democratic candidate for District 34 out from Brownsville, who's challenging Vicente Gonzalez, the incumbent there. And he had some numbers that I think, at least in his district, 48% of all Democratic primary voters were first-time voters. And this is in a district that's heavily Latino, about 65% Latino. So we're seeing if that is true, and we'll see the final numbers afterwards and try to slice this out as best as possible to report back to you all. Latinos had a huge part in driving this breaking primary voter turnout happening here in 2026. Numbers that we haven't seen since 2002 in the last 24 years. So something is definitely happening. Now, I wanted to also talk about Congressional District 35. So Congressional District 35 is a district that is mostly now, it got redistricted, it got gerrymandered, it got taken away basically from Greg Casado, the progressive Justice Democrat out of Austin, champion for worker rights and economic populace and social justice, who really fights for social justice for immigrants and all folks that have been underrepresented in this country. He's a really great guy. I got to know him personally. And now he's going to represent Congressional District 37. Lloyd Doggett is retiring, stepping down to open up the room there for him to represent District 37. And now District 35 got shifted over to the San Antonio area, but not the city area per se. It's got some Bexar County, but it's a large part of it is Guadalupe County, Wilson County, those areas. If anybody was following Michelle Vallejo's race in the last primary against Monica de la Cruz, Guadalupe County, Wilson County were part of Texas 15 previously, but now it has its own district, which is Congressional District 35. And the Republicans drew this district during this gerrymandering process, having in mind that Latinos were probably going to stick with Republicans, that this Latino wave towards Republicans was going to be permanent. And based on everything that I've been mentioning in the last 10 minutes or so on how Latinos are shifting both in urban and rural areas here in Texas, I just don't think that's true. So I went ahead and looked at Congressional District 35 and how many of the registered voters in that district were Latino, that had Latino surnames, and it was 42%. So I think Republicans are really gambled it here, really gambled on Congressional District 35, thinking that they're going to pick up a sure seat for Republicans. Now I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, I don't think this is a sure win for the Republicans, especially how Latinos are potentially voting this year. And so I went ahead and looked at Voter Hub's numbers of primary turnout. And that was very interesting and that was very eye opening. What I was able to see was that Democrats in Guadalupe County doubled in number in this primary. There's still slightly more Republicans voting than Democrats in Guadalupe County. Keep in mind, this is a very Republican county, so it's very hard to win it in this county for Democrats. But 8,000 Republican primary voters to 6,000 Democratic primary voters is very different from 2022, where it was 4-1. The margin was 4-1 for Republicans in that primary. Democrats doubled the number of people actually showing up, or people like there's twice the amount of people voting for Democrats than they did last time. Republicans are stagnant. The same number of people that voted for Republicans in that primary or in that Republican primary in 2022 is the same number now. The only numbers that were gained were for Democrats. So I'm willing to bet that Latinos, maybe low propensity Latinos in this Guadalupe, Wilson, rural Bexar County area, were showing up to vote in this election in the Democratic primary. And that could spell trouble for the people that drew this Republican or supposed Republican safe district. And so I know there's Democratic primary race going on there. I know there's a sheriff running for that district in the Democratic primary and a few other people. I'm not too well informed on who's running there, but whoever comes out of that primary, it's going to be interesting to see if the national Democratic committees, the DNC, the DCCC, all those groups are going to be invested in a race like that. So we'll see what happens there. But I think that's a good example of how the Latino vote in this congressional district, the Latino vote could completely subvert or completely destroy this equation that Republicans had during their gerrymandering process, and just destroying this perception that they were going to pick up 5 seats for Donald Trump during the mid-decade redistricting process. But now, thinking about everything I've mentioned so far in this conversation, it's going to be critically important that we win back Congress. And it's expected for Democrats to win back the U.S. House of Representatives and maybe even the U.S. Senate. Now, I've had conversations about the U.S. Senate race here in Texas, and in another episode, I'll talk about some of the races happening in other states that are going to be critical to get the majority back in the Senate, like Alaska, Ohio, Maine, North Carolina. I'll save it for another time. But today I wanted to focus on the U.S. House of Representatives. Now, it's predicted for Democrats to get it back. I think there's a generic poll, Democrats having an 8 or 9 point lead there. And of course, we've seen what's happening here in Texas and what's been happening in these special elections and 25 elections where Democrats have made a lot of gains in state races and special elections. But I would like to think about a few of these Latino majority congressional districts that are up for grabs, that are toss-ups right now. Now, the Cook Political Report has a list of congressional races that are considered toss-ups, right? So they have different categories. Some are safe Democrats or safe or lean Democrat, and then we have these toss-ups in the middle. And 2 toss-ups by Cook Political Report include Congressional District 28, which is Henry Cuellar's seat, and Congressional District 34, which is Vicente Gonzalez's seat. They do not include as a toss-up Congressional District 15. They haven't shifted it towards a toss-up, even though Bobby Pulido, who right now is currently in a primary race against Dr. Ada Cuellar, there's been a lot of attention being driven to that district, particularly right now, since a lot of Latinos are shifting back towards Democrats. There's a lot of conversation about that district. So I'd like to talk about Congressional District 28, which is Henry Cuellar. Talk about 34, Vicente Gonzalez. I'd like to talk about District 15. I already spoke about District 35, so we could not get into that one already. And then I'd like to also talk about two other districts outside of Texas in the Southwest that have similar demographics that are also toss-ups, which is Gabe Vasquez District, New Mexico 2nd. They're in southern New Mexico, and the Arizona Congressional 6th District, which is right now currently held by Republicans. He's Comani, a Mexican-American Republican there in southeastern Arizona and the Tucson area. Now, why I'm thinking about these districts is because these are the districts where Latinos could have the most impact, at least in the Southwest. I haven't looked up at the other districts, perhaps in Florida or in the Northeast, where there's a high population of Latinos. Maybe in North Carolina. I know there's a couple of districts there. But I think the Southwest is a good starting point. And so we could look at these 5 districts in the Southwest that could be critically important in helping Democrats gain back the majority in the U.S. House of Representatives. Now, Congressional District 28 and Congressional District 34, which is Vicente Gonzalez and Henry Cuellar seats, are plus 10, plus 12 Trump districts. The way that the maps are drawn right now are maps that Trump won by 10 or 12 points. Now, does that mean that the Democrats are going to lose by 10 or 12 points? I don't believe so. Think about what happened in North Texas. I mentioned Senate District 9 earlier with Taylor Remett's seat, who was outspent 20-1 in a very red seat that was plus 17 for Donald Trump, went plus 14 for a progressive economic populist Democrat. So it's very viable to think, it's very possible that even though these are plus 10, plus 12 districts for Donald Trump, that Henry Cuellar and whoever's going to be the nominee for District 34 are going to be able to carry those districts as Democrats. It's very possible. And it's actually, in my mind, it's likely. Based on the trend, like I mentioned on today's topic, is how Latino voters are trending back towards center-left candidates all across Texas. So that would be interesting to look at. Now, I personally, I'm not a fan of Henry Cuellar. I think a lot of people know that. He got pardoned by Donald Trump for a scandal that he got himself involved with bribery. But I do know that he has deep relationships with a lot of local elected officials from Starr County, Zapata, Webb County. He has deep ties there. And he actually performed very well even during the Trump era in 2024. There was a lot of split ticket voting where people voted for Donald Trump, for example, in Starr County, and then, of course, voted for Henry Cuellar. So I think Henry Cuellar is in a very strong position there and is now in the 81% Latino district. So that's something to also think about. If Latinos are voting overwhelmingly against Donald Trump, makes me think that Henry Cuellar is in a pretty safe spot right now. Gonzalez's seat, Congressional District 2034. It expands. So it's from Brownsville, so it's all Cameron County. And by the way, this is where Elon Musk has Starbase and SpaceX happening. So there's been a lot of activity there and political activity there because of Elon Musk's presence there with SpaceX. And then expands through Kingsville, Claiborne County. It's got Raymondville, and then it goes all the way up to Nueces County. But with the addition of Nueces County, it made the district less Hispanic and more white. So what used to be like an 80+% Latino district is now like a 60-something, 61, 65% Hispanic district. So still majority Hispanic, but much less than it had historically been. And so that addition of Nueces County gives it about a plus 10, plus 12 Trump district. But guess what? The primary votes right now in Nueces County, there are more people voting in the Democratic primary than the Republican primary in Nueces County. And I'd like to keep in mind that Ken Paxton and John Cornyn are spending a ton of money in this primary. There's a reason, if people wanted to vote Republican, there's a reason for them to vote Republican right now, because there's this face-off, highly contested Senate race happening in the Republican primary. So even with having that, Nueces County, which is normally a red county, is having more people show up in the Democratic primary. And let me tell you, some of these poll workers that are these Republican activists that work at these polling locations that have to be nonpartisan, they must be going crazy. They have never seen this happen. So it's something cool that I was thinking about the other day. But I think because of these trends that we're seeing there, because we're seeing larger voting trends and turnout of Democrats in the Rio Grande Valley with a combination of turnout of all these new voters in Nueces County that are voting in the Democratic primary, it could make that race very interesting. I'm not sure the Democrat is a guaranteed win there. We do have an interesting primary race there on the Republican side between Mayra Flores and Eric Flores. The race of the Flores there And interesting to see that Donald Trump endorsed Eric Flores, who I personally have gotten to know a few times. We're both from Western Hidalgo County, from De La Hoya. We are both went to De La Hoya Independent School District. We have a lot of friends in common. He's running as a Republican, which was interesting to see outside of, I think, of his district where he lives, but he's been able to garner a lot of support out there. So it's been interesting to watch that. So we'll see what happens in that primary, who the Democrat gets to face off of with, but should be an interesting one to follow, and one that is going to be majorly decided by the Latino vote and how many Latinos decide to show up in that primary. So we've covered those two districts. Now, the other district in the Rio Grande Valley, of course, is not a toss-up yet in the Cook Political Report or other pollsters and political predictors, but I think very much the Democrats has a very strong chance here. It is a district that is 68% Latino, which is Congressional District 15, the race that Bobby Pulido is running for. He has a primary challenger in Ada Cuellar, Dr. Ada Cuellar. And I think Bobby Pulido is very much favored in this race to take on Monica de la Cruz, who has been this MAGA person that has been in Congress for a couple cycles now, who is very unpopular right now, in my opinion, very unpopular with the builders, very unpopular with a lot of working class folks in the district. Never has town halls, hasn't met with a lot of common folks in the area. Maybe just makes special appearances in closed settings, but really has not been the type of person that is willing to meet with a lot of community members. So really hoping that the Democratic nominee here wins this race. Now, we're looking at a district, like I mentioned, that's 68% Hispanic, but it's plus 17, plus 18 Trump district. So I could see why the Cook Political Report could be hesitant here, but could very much mirror what happened in Senate District 9 could be happening here in this district. Now, Bobby Pulido, if he is a nominee, in which I think it's going to happen, and I think a lot of people agree it's going to happen, he has deep ties and deep roots in this community through Tejano roots. I grew up in the Tejano Norteño industry. My dad was a musician. My brother was in Tejano radio as a disc jockey. I know this world very closely, and I can tell you that people are very much attached to a musico Bobby Pulido, who's been around in the industry for 30 years. So when he stepped into this race, he had automatic name ID, and that's been his advantage during this primary. That could be a very strong point for him going into November of 26. Now, the shot at Democrats in South Texas is that these are very conservative incumbents. And for y'all that know me personally, I'm left-leaning, I'm progressive. I've spent a little bit over 10, 14 years doing community organizing work, and I've been working to create more of an infrastructure to help more progressive candidates to run for office, whether it be at a federal, state, or local level. And then, of course, we had Jessica Cisneros just a couple years ago that after a few cycles, she fell very short. And she was a Justice Democrat who fell very short from defeating Henry Cuellar in that primary. So there is a part of the Rio Grande Valley that responds very well to economic populist candidates like Jessica Cisneros. We'll see what happens with Etienne Rosas, who's being vastly outspent by Vicente Gonzalez right now. He's a good friend. I just had him on a couple days ago. We had a great conversation about the need for better representation and economic populist policies that are going to help a lot of the working class people in the valley. Taking it back to the 20 primary, Bernie Sanders won pretty convincingly in all the border counties in Texas. So we know that economic populism is a good message for people in the valley, because people, like I mentioned here, are working class people that really care about protecting their family, and economic stress is always sort of a point of stress here, but something that we overcome, but we figure it out by helping each other out. So a lot of the messages that come from progressive populists really resonate. So I think in the future, there's going to be some efforts to garner support for more progressive or economic populist candidates in the Rio Grande Valley to take on this establishment democratic or compadrismo politics that's been going on and reigning over the Rio Grande Valley for a long time, that I think has been the reason that has actually helped Republicans gain down there. So I think I talked about this yesterday. I won't get into it today. That the conventional thought is that you reach Republican voters by being more conservative, but we actually think by being more of an economic populist in South Texas, because so many people are living to paycheck. That's the way to go for a Democrat. Now, that's South Texas. Now, let's shift over to this a little bit more into the Southwest. We have the New Mexico 2nd Congressional District. Gabe Vasquez is the candidate there. He's the incumbent there. It's a +1 or +2 Trump district. He was able to hold on to it, so he's trying to protect that seat. It includes all the border counties there with Mexico and southern New Mexico. It's about 48-50% Hispanic, so it's not as high as the ones in South Texas, but clearly it's one that needs to be protected. And we're thinking about having a majority in Congress. That's one that definitely needs to be protected. So a race to look at for people that are maybe looking at districts outside of Texas that maybe need to spend their money, send their money, or family and friends in that area, one to pay attention to. Now we also have the Congressional District 6 in southeastern Arizona in the Tucson area. It's held by Cisco Mani. Cisco Mani is a Mexican-American Republican that's been there, won by a very short margin in 2024, and now has a opponent who is likely going to be Joanna Mendoza, who is a veteran who is being supported right now by progressive veteran groups, Vote Vets and Common Defense. I know some people out there in Arizona that are going to be working that race. I'm really excited about this. This is a district that's 35% Hispanic, so nowhere near as high as the South Texas districts, but Latinos could very much make the difference. It will be a Mexican American or Latina progressive Democrat with veteran progressive groups backing her versus a Latino Mexican American Republican incumbent. So it should be interesting to watch how Latinos respond to that race. Now, I know that Cisco Mani didn't do very well. Trump did better than Cisco Mani with Latinos in that district. So I know his relationships with Latino voters can't be that great if Trump outperformed you with Latinos in your own district. So I think Joanna Mendoza has a great shot there. I know she's done community organizing work and has a veteran background. And I know a lot of people that do community organizing work in Arizona are very excited about her as a candidate out there in the Tucson, southeastern Arizona area. A little bit or north of that, one of the biggest landmass district in Arizona is a congressional district 2. We have Jonathan Ness. Now, that district is not very Hispanic, but I still want to talk about it because it's about 20% Native American, indigenous, and it's about 10-15% Hispanic. So if you combine both, it's a strong group electorate. Jonathan Nez, which we used to be the chief or president of Navajo Nation at one point, ran for Congress last time, fell 9 points short. It includes a bunch of other rural areas that are conservative and white, but we've been seeing some shifts towards more progressive candidates, even in some of the reddest areas. So, for example, in Cottonwood, Arizona, there in northern Arizona, that is part of this district, progressive candidates were able to sweep the city council race, which is incredible to see. A progressive just recently won a city council seat in Prescott, Arizona, which is a hotbed of MAGA country out in Arizona, supposedly. And that also sits within that district. So there's some interesting movement going on there. If more white folks actually start voting for Democrats, as we're seeing them vote for these city council progressive candidates, like I mentioned in Prescott and in Cottonwood. And then we actually see a higher number of Latino voters showing up in that race. And then, of course, turning out more Native American voters, Navajo voters, and other tribes there that are in that region turn out. It could be a strong coalition to turn that one around. I think political Cook, like the Cook Political Report, has it slightly Republican, but could be interesting in this current political climate. I wanted to mention last, in California, there's one district. I know there was this Proposition 50 that redistrict the districts in California as a response to what Texas was doing. And so these districts are likely going to go Democrat. I just wanted to mention the California 22nd district, which is in Bakersfield, that's currently held by a Republican named Valadeo, who has been barely holding on to this seat the last couple cycles, who's likely going to lose it now. That district is 59% Latino. There is a guy running in that primary named Randy Villegas. He's a Bernie-style populist. He's taking on a more centrist Democrat in that race. So that could be a cool one to have to add to the progressive network of people in Congress. Randy Villegas, if you all haven't looked him up, that should be an interesting one to look at. So that will be a Latino showdown in that primary between a Latino, more centrist, like Latino, versus a more economic populist progressive candidate and Randy Villegas in that primary. So that's what I have today, guys. I know I threw a lot at you all today, but there's lots going on, lots to pay attention to. The Latino vote is, I mentioned, the true battleground in this country, and we have the power right now. We really do, more than ever before, and it's time for us to exercise that power and to defend it and to protect it. Right now, there's a lot of efforts from MAGA and Trump and their allies and billionaires to take away our voting rights. And to make it harder for people to actually have that right to vote, to show up to vote, they're trying to pass the SAVE Act, which we'll talk about later, and just making it more difficult. They're talking about sending ICE to polling sites and crazy. We're hearing some of the craziest things I ever heard of. So we need to be very watchful. So that'll be another thing that we have to work on this year. But with that said, y'all have a beautiful day. Take care, y'all. See you in the next one.